Professor Voorhoeve, welcome to the Roosevelt Study Centre. Welcome to Middelburg.
Thank you.
You're here to give a lecture shortly this afternoon with the interesting title of 9 challenges to be faced by the transatlantic community. And this is based on the title of your forthcoming book, Negen Plagen Tegelijk, which will appear on 18th of April. Perhaps we could begin if you just give a short introduction of what these 9 challenges that we're going to face actually are.
Yes, thank you. In the book, I try to analyze the dynamics among 9 long-term trends, which are very troublesome in the world at large, like world population growth, the increasing world poverty problem, the climate change, and a number of other very serious developments which have to be tackled more effectively than the world is doing up till now. And in the lecture this afternoon, I translate this global complex set of long-term trends to what the Atlantic community can do about it. And that is much, as the Atlantic community is a large share of the world community and influential, leading in many international organizations. And it is not only facing the task of putting its own houses in order, but also contributing to better global governance outside the Atlantic area. Of course, much in the world political and economic system is changing and shifting towards Asia, but for many decades in the future, North America and the European Union will still have a leading position. And they can help the rise of China and India, we should not forget India, to encourage those nations to strengthen global governance and not become unilateralists. Up till now, both governments do not yet seek a big role internationally, but they will undoubtedly carve one out for themselves.
So you feel that the transatlantic community essentially has a special responsibility with these global challenges?
Yes, indeed. First of all, it's the leading economic area, even though China will perhaps overtake the United States in economic size in about 20 years. India is going to be the foremost power in the long term, also because it will rise to 1.6 billion people, larger than China, and it is growing almost as rapidly. The advantage of India is that it is a democracy. All democracies have their faults. And in India, it is of course still the remnants of the caste system and forms of corruption, which you also find in other democracies. One of the tasks, I think, of the Atlantic community is to bring India into a structure of cooperation of the major democracies. We see the word democracy up till now too much as a Western invention, and do not realize, are not aware of the fact that, for instance, the first inscription and codification of human rights was an Indian
Interesting detail.
of 3,500 years ago. We also should be aware that the size of the so-called West is relatively shrinking. The United States and Europe, and if you add Japan and Australia and New Zealand, the so-called West, even though part of it is in the East, is about 1 billion people in a world of 7 billion. That's 1 out of 7, 14%. In the year 2050, based on present demographic studies, it will be a world of over 9 billion people. With also the economic changes and the focal point of the world economy changing to Asia, we should be very much aware that the West cannot rule the rest of the world. and should learn to design its foreign policies in a more modest fashion with less hubris than, for instance, the design of the Iraq intervention by the United States and Britain, thinking that they could change a country into a democracy.
Yes.
So this enormous change in the world system will force us to rethink our own policies. Also for other reasons. We cannot stop climate change anymore. At least 2 degrees centigrade will be added to the average temperature. That will have vast effects in the world, particularly on Africa and Asia. And in my book, I project that we will see a doubling of world migration and refugees. We will face a new class of environmental refugees, people who have to leave their home country because the environment is degraded so much that there's no future for them.
That is also one of the 9 challenges.
The increasing, doubling, as I think of migration. And that sounds worrisome, but it's even a very modest and conservative estimate. I've seen estimates by UN studies of the number of refugees going up to 1 billion, 1 out of, at that time, 9 people. We are not aware often how serious the situation of mankind in general is. Do we realize day by day that 1 out of 7 human beings suffers from hunger? It's 1 billion people now, according to FAO. In order to feed the world population by the year 2050, and our students will be living then, and our children and grandchildren, we need to increase food production by 70%, 70%, in a world which has only a few percentages additional farmland, and a world which thinks that we should use more and more farmland to produce biofuel, which is a big mistake. We have already a lack of water, irrigation water, fresh water. That is the crucial factor for increasing farm production. We all know that we will run out of fossil fuels, at least oil and gas. Not coal, because there's plenty of coal in the world, but it's a dangerous fuel. It kills many more people every year.
It's very dirty fuel.
It's a very dirty fuel and very dangerous, given all the mining accidents. It kills hundreds and hundreds of people every year. And although the United States and China and India have plenty of coal, Britain incidentally too, with present technologies it's a very difficult source, and it doesn't tackle climate change. So we need to shift also our energy policies, and my book concludes that the only thing which really works in the short term is savings, energy savings. I try to indicate, to prove, that we all can do with about half the energy we need.
So consume less.
We all can consume about half of what we are used to, because we live in a high energy society which thinks energy is plentiful and costs very little. But if we look at energy saving countries, if we look at our parents and European civilization 50 years ago, it's no problem to have a civilized country with only half the energy consumption, or even less, than we are used to. We waste an awful amount of energy, and thereby create a very serious problem for particularly tropical and subtropical countries. And they cannot escape this anymore. And it's the only energy policy which works immediately and saves money. And we should apply in our policies not pies in the sky, not castles in Spain, not technology which hasn't been proven yet, of which we don't know how much it costs, whether it will be economic. We should apply the technologies and the means which work now. Otherwise, you are irresponsible because you shift problems to the future.
That's true, yeah. And do you see any positive signs, say, with new forms of consensus building internationally, thinking here of, say, the G20, so that we shouldn't just rely on the UN, but there are more possibilities being created?
We need a lot of improvements of national and international government, much more effective policies. And in my book, I make some suggestions about how modern democracies can improve themselves and shift from short-term populist policies to long-term policies which are evidence-based and science-based. I think the international institutions which we have are still much too weak. They need to be strengthened. The strongest institution is the European Union as far as international governance is concerned, but it's still much too weak. And it has to shift to forms of qualified majority decision-making, also in its external policies. Otherwise, it continues to lag behind the problems. Of course, we need a strong improvement of the United Nations, but that is blocked by disagreement among the major powers. And I suggest we should also look into the possibility of establishing an organization of democratic states to encourage democracy, the spreading of democracy, democratization of countries which are prepared to do so, help them with electoral laws, electoral training, building up trade unions, which are essential for a well-functioning democracy. There's a lot to be done, and there are many possibilities. And the big advantage of having a global organization of democratic states would be that you also bridge divides like the North-South divide. There are a number of third world democracies. Let me put it in a different way, a more defensive way. If you see that as an Atlantic community of democracies, you are on the defense because the rest of the world is making vast strides forward in economic and population size and new forms of highly technological authoritarianism, then you should think, should we just accept this and withdraw into ourselves, or should we widen our club? Should we strengthen by getting new members of our democratic community? And there are possibilities which we are not thinking about enough.
Yes, so this is an interesting idea, a sort of community of democracies that has several important advocates, including, of course, Ivo Daalder, the US ambassador to NATO.
Yes.
Do you think this is an issue that could gain more momentum in the coming years?
I hope so. The idea has its origins already in the 1950s, and it comes up every now and then is pushed aside as not very practical or dividing present organizations. It should not divide the United Nations. An organization of democratic states should be a caucus in the United Nations. We should be aware that of the 193 UN members, 2/3 are not democratic. And it would be very useful to strengthen the position of countries with democratic political systems and democratic foreign policy formation if they meet regularly and coordinate their policies, like we're used to already in NATO, but then focused on national security policy, like we're used to in the European Union. So the rapid changes in the world require rapidly better answers than the old ones.
I understand, yes. If I can finish with a very brief closing question. I'm curious, if I read your book, will I end up on the final page an optimist or a pessimist?
An optimist. The beginning of the book will make you a pessimist, but I try to avoid both optimism and pessimism because they are in a way biases. They are attitudes towards reality. You should, in a scholarly book, be clinical. And I end with an exposition of future energy policy, and the last word is that the sun still shines for the next 5 billion years, and there's a lot of energy there.